on this panel will be Professor Alexis Harris. She's an associate professor of sociology here at the University of Washington, Seattle, and she will discuss the multiple dimensions that can be used to frame our varying reactions to the current state-sponsored violence. Please welcome her.
So I am a sociologist. I study the criminal justice system. I'll talk a little bit about what I study specifically. But I am going to go off script a little bit because I want to acknowledge that when we see these pictures of black women and black men and black kids, children that are killed, it's hard. For those of us who have partners and kids, sons and daughters, mothers or fathers, uncles who look like these people, and hopefully everybody in this room feels emotion, but for those of us who have people in our family who are the targets of state-sponsored violence, sitting in the audience in an academic setting talking about these things are really, really hard. And as a professor, I try and sanitize this in my class and be very objective and not show emotion, but today it's very hard not to because it hurts. It's hard, and I think it's hard to think about how do we understand this. And so what I'll do for the first half of my time is to kind of frame this, I guess sanitize it, but kind of frame it so that we can think about and talk about where we can go forward in dialogues with those people who think differently than us on these topics and don't understand why we keep fighting in the streets and keep saying Black Lives Matter. Gives us a little more ammunition to frame it. And then I'll talk a little bit about my research that really links exactly what Stephanie has talked about, how slavery is still present in contemporary American society. So what I want you to do is pick up one of these faces that you've seen, right? Assata's would be great, but pick one of the faces of the people who had been killed. And think of a frame around them, 4 ledges on the frame. And the top sort of first dimension, a way to understand what's happening, is the historical context that every one of my co-panelists have talked about. That top frame there, that's the history that's kind of pressing down on us and that's ever present. It's from slavery, it's to black codes, it's to Jim Crow laws, it's to contemporary criminal justice, to all of the sanctions that continue to focus on racialized people in this country, Black, Native American, Latino, and some South Pacific Islanders especially have disproportionate confinement. That's our history and that matters, and I know people can't matter. In my classroom I do an exercise, I don't know if anyone's here from my Social 362 class, that's really uncomfortable for me because what I do is I play a video on YouTube on the screen behind me, and then I just lecture and I talk really, really quietly. And it takes a few minutes for the students, they kind of freak out, they're raising their hand, Professor Harris, I can't hear you, what are you doing, you're not making sense. And I just kind of keep going until I'm like shaking so much because I'm so nervous from the anxiety it's producing. And I do that to talk about the role of history. And for some of us, the music is playing loudly all the time. That history of enslavement, the history of Japanese internment, the history of the mass killing of indigenous peoples, the history of the changing borders with and pushing out Mexican citizens who were born in this land and pushing them out beyond borders of the United States. That history matters so much for so many people, and I get it. Some people don't. Some people don't feel that history. Some people don't hear that music, but that's always there for many of us. So that history is our top frame pressing down on us. And then on one side, we also have this cultural context. I think a lot of us don't understand the importance of, we've had this shift from, Eduardo Bonilla Silva is a sociologist, and he writes a book titled Racism Without Racists, right? And we've had this shift. Yes, we have President Obama, right? But we've had this shift from the KKK folks out there in their hoods, and it's no longer politically correct to be racist, but there's still so much prejudice and racism out there, and it's particularly in the form of implicit biases. And that's embedded in our very culture, the biases that people have. So it allows for people to say, yeah, you know, I understand how scary Trayvon Martin could have been. I understand that those Skittles and the iced tea, or I understand how Mike Brown looked scary, right? And justify the killing of these innocent men and young children's lives. So that implicit bias is always present, and I would force you, and not force you, I can't force you to do anything, but I would encourage you, if I had the power, if I ruled the world, and as Nas says in his song, to think about the implicit biases that we all have, right? And the prejudice that we all have, and then the privilege, right? For you not to have to worry about whether or not your black boy is going to be stopped by the police, right? My husband, after all this stuff happened, my husband said, I just want to let you know, the car that I drive, I've moved the registration. I put the papers in the flap above the whatever that's called, the visor, because he doesn't want to have to reach over. My husband's African American. He doesn't want to have to reach over into the glove compartment if he gets stopped. So he wanted to let me know where the papers were. We have to worry about this on every single day, and that's part of our culture. So on one side, top side, we have our history. One side, we have this culture, and embedded in that culture is this implicit bias that targets black and brown men and also women. And then on another side, we have our structural context, right? The institutions. This is very institution. Some of you want us to challenge this institution. We can do that at a later date. But we have the institutions. And in every single, I teach social problems, every single institution, from healthcare to education to the criminal justice system, every single institution, we have racial disparities and disproportionality. It's systematic, it's been constant through history, and it's present today. And that's framing what we see here with the criminal justice system, with our education system. So that's another frame. And then the bottom frame, and I think it's definitely in a lot of what my colleagues have talked about today, but is this role of power and social control. And all of that, our history, our culture, our institutions are embedded in the need for those in power to maintain social control over the bodies, particularly the bodies of people who scare them, right? And that's from slavery to our educational system and what we learn and don't learn, to our healthcare system, and who's the subject of research and who's not, and all of that. So that's sort of the fourth frame, is this role of power and social control that I want you to think about. So just real briefly, I study the criminal justice system. Dan gave us some of the data. 2.25 million people are now living behind bars. Since 1972, our system has expanded by 700%. 700% to convict and incarcerate, particularly people of color. We have over 7 million people who are in supervision, who are controlled. Every movement that they make are controlled by the criminal justice system. While 1 out of every 7 white men are incarcerated, 1 out of every 36 Latino men are incarcerated, and 1 out of every 12 black men are incarcerated. And that hurts as someone who studies this system to have to teach those statistics. I also study something called monetary sanctions. And one thing that we haven't hit on today, is just because there's so many different issues, is the economic role, the role of wealth and power and economics in all of this. And that was very clear in Dr. King's particularly his later speeches, as organizing, what he was doing when he was killed. So I study something called monetary sanctions, and these are the fines and fees that are imposed to people convicted. I particularly study the felony system. And in Washington State, the average amount that a person receives, and this isn't just restitution, this is above restitution, right, is $1,200 per felony conviction, right? That's to pay for their public defender that they're appointed because they can't afford a public defender. That's to pay for court costs. That's to pay for getting their DNA, even if they've already had their DNA extracted from them to track them. So $1,200 per felony conviction in Washington State. So that's where over $250 million is owed by people convicted of just felonies in Washington State. And this is, I argue, particularly since the late 90s, this is the new iteration of social control. So even after incarceration, even on top of the felony conviction, people who we already know are racially and economically marginalized in this country are then given legal financial debt that they can't declare bankruptcy on. There's 12% interest in Washington State that accrues on that. There's a $100 annual surcharge. So there's this dumping on top of everything that a person goes through once they receive a felony conviction of legal debt. They're indebted to the state literally for the rest of their life with this debt. Really interesting, I've been studying this, I've been working on this for over 7 years, and just after Michael Brown was killed, a group of public defenders in St. Louis County did a study. They analyzed some of the data of the defendants that they were working with. And this wasn't even just at the felony level, this was also at the municipal level. And they highlighted Ferguson. And Ferguson had roughly 21,000 residents, 67% of whom were African American, 14% were unemployed, 22% of the population were living in poverty. So this was an impoverished, marginalized, mostly black city. The city itself, out of these 21,000 people, recouped $2.2 million in 1 year. So because of the debt. And this debt was debt for getting a ticket for not going into contract with the local garbage collectors. Because people couldn't afford to pay for their garbage pickup, people got tickets for that. Okay? So people were getting this debt imposed to them. Once you have the debt and you don't make payments, then they can be arrested and incarcerated. And so this report highlights how, based on even municipal traffic fines, people were under surveillance from the state, from the city of Ferguson, and incarcerated for non-payment. the city issued over 25,000 warrants. That's 21,000 residents, 25,000 warrants in Ferguson alone. People, to raise that $2.2 million, that averaged $272 per household. And this is a city that's impoverished, but $272 per household to cover what the city was trying to extract from its citizens. So this picture on Ferguson is not an anomaly. This is happening across the nation. I know because I study it, right? This is part of the contemporary prison industrial complex, part of the contemporary landscape of social control and power. It's this flipping of enslavement. No longer are bodies enslaved and forced to labor, but they're connected to the civil and the criminal and the federal systems by debt, by financial debt. So the past is always present, is so true. Again, with our frame, think about the history, think about the culture, think about the institutions, and think about the role of power and social control. And I think I'm really excited for us to sort of move forward and hearing from you guys, and not just us lecturing at you guys, but engaging in these ideas. I think, as what my co-panelists have said, some of the things I would encourage you to think about what we can do is that we can continue to have these conversations. I even think it's more important for us to have these conversations and this framework with people who don't think like us. And it's hard and it's uncomfortable, and I did something that got some attention, and so random people at my gym everywhere have been talking to me, and they don't get it. They really don't get the importance of history and the emotional reaction that we have had to this. So it's hard, I don't like to do it, especially when I'm trying to work out, but but it is important for us to push back, because we can do that, right? Because when we do it in a big groups and in coalition building and all that, we can, I think, change people's minds. And then also policy. I believe in making, even though it's like sort of incremental changes, but fighting for policies that matter, because I think at least within our institutions, that's what's going to protect us and help us move forward. So thank you for listening and for this wonderful day, and I look forward to the conversations over lunch.